Hello, friends and teacher. This is my presentation on utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. My name is Şevval. So, my question was, consider the following objections to Mill's view. Say how convincing you find it, how Mill might reply, and whether you consider the reply convincing. The objection is as follows. Utilitarians think that everyone's happiness matters equally. So if I'm going to be a utilitarian, I need to give everyone's happiness equal weight in my thinking. But this is impossible. Even if I am not a selfish person, I am bound to care more about the happiness of my family, friends, and countrymen than about the happiness of complete strangers. So utilitarianism must be false. But the utilitarians do not think that individual happiness is the most important. They think that the contributions to the general sense of happiness is what is important. So this objection is not quite strong. My thesis is that I do not find these objections convincing at all after reading Mill, because the sense of happiness in utilitarianism is more complex than these objections suggest. So Mill would reply to these arguments by saying that the sense of happiness in utilitarianism is not merely individual happiness, but it is a general sense of happiness in which people sometimes sacrifice from their own happiness in order to increase the level of happiness on a global extent. I find Mill's argument convincing because by sacrificing individual happiness and enduring the struggles that add to others' happiness, a sense of dignity appears, which can be the highest form of happiness. So, according to Mill and utilitarianists, happiness is not a concept that is about bodily pleasures, but it's also about mental pleasures. Therefore, the pleasure of virtue might be the highest form of happiness, although the person that sacrifices and makes the virtue of sacrificing suffers a lot along the way. This might bring a higher form of happiness in quality, actually. Therefore, the concept of happiness in utilitarianism is much more complicated than the objections suggest. My argument is that my premise one is pleasures differ in quality, as I talked about it earlier, because Mill gives the example of swine, and these are pigs, and he doesn't think that the pleasure is all about animally pleasure, like eating or breathing or sexual pleasures, but he also talks about humanly pleasures. These are the mental pleasures. These are what's important. These are what brings the highest form of happiness, although it brings so much more pain and enduring struggles. So my premise 2 is the highest form of pleasure for human beings would be dignity rather than the pleasure of swine. So dignity actually creates, it's actually inherent in humans, and the laws are based on the human dignity. Therefore, this might bring a higher form of happiness into people rather than just bodily pleasures. My premise 2 is when people sacrifice their individual happiness to make others happy, they actually reach a higher form of happiness in quality, although they go through some level of suffering, because this kind of sacrifice makes them actually superior to others because they know how to achieve happiness. They make others happy. And this is a virtuous act in a social context, because one sacrifices one's own happiness to make others happy, which is a big virtue and brings a higher quality of happiness with the sense of dignity. My conclusion is that, for my premises, sacrificing one's own happiness for others actually makes one reach a higher level of happiness in terms of quality, and hence, sacrifice does not turn out to be a sacrifice at all. It is done for the sake of satisfying a person's sense of dignity. This act of sacrifice actually serves that person's happiness, because the sense of dignity, which is the highest form of mental pleasures, are satisfied within that person. And although he or she gives bodily pleasures, bodily happiness, or worldly happiness to other people, that person who sacrificed in the first place actually gains a better, higher form of happiness in terms of quality. So thesis of the text I engage with is as follows. Happiness is the existence of pleasure and abstinence of pain. Yet, the concept of pleasure in the simple definition is much more complex than the word suggests. Sense of pleasure must have a quality different than bodily pleasures. It is not the same as swine. So here's a quote from Mill. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. Parallel with the sense of dignity of humans, the quality of pleasure addresses mental pleasures more. So actually, as I explained earlier, Mill defines pleasure in a different sense than the word itself suggests. Well, so when we think about pleasure, we think about, I don't know, bodily pleasures like doing sports or eating or sexual desires. But according to Mill, it's much more elevated than that. It has a human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, he says. So animal appetites that we all possess, but we also possess another type of appetites, which once we discover them, we cannot live without satisfying those needs, which are mental needs. Our mental faculties, like virtue or intelligence or intellectual properties. So, argument of the text I engage with. So I will first present the quote and then premises and conclusion. So Mill suggests that the possibility and the obligation of learning to do without happiness for the sake of something which he prizes more than his individual happiness. But this something, what is it, unless the happiness of others or some of the requisites of happiness? It is noble to be capable of resigning entirely one's own portion of happiness or chances of it. But after all, this self-sacrifice must be for some end. It is not its own end. And if we are told that its end is not happiness, but virtue, which is better than happiness, I ask, would the sacrifice be made if the hero or martyr did not believe that it would earn for others immunity from similar sacrifices? So actually, Mill suggests that although one sacrifices from one's own happiness, he or she still contributes to the happiness. And hence, if the aim, the goal was not happiness at all, if that person who sacrificed did not think that his or her sacrifice would not contribute to the general sense of happiness, general happiness of other people, they will not do it in the first place at all, because according to Mill, every action's end is happiness, and if they do not see this, they wouldn't act on it. And so this brings also another, it's a noble sacrifice actually. It brings a sense of dignity to people. So actually these are much more valued than happiness, much more valued than simple happiness, these virtue and nobility and dignity. And also, I think in some sense, the nobleness and the virtue and dignity that these sacrifices bring together are valued more than happiness, and actually brings another form of happiness, another quality of happiness. So the premise one for the argument in the text is, there are people who sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of others. Premise 2 is, the sacrifice might leave one stripped of one's own happiness, but still contributes to the general happiness in a wild worldly sense. So I explained all these before. Although they sacrifice from their own happiness, they still do it for the sake of happiness in a general sense, in a worldly sense. Premise 3 is that virtue is held to be higher than happiness. Premise 4 is that happiness, according to utilitarians, is the higher end. Premise 5, Virtue in the context of sacrifice should create a different, higher form of happiness, since the end of every action is happiness. My conclusion is that sacrifice of one's own happiness for others adds to the happiness in a global sense, but it also creates a higher form of happiness in an individual, such as I explained, for dignity, nobleness, virtue. Hence, sacrificing one's own happiness for others does not contradict the utilitarian school of thought, because it still is for the utility of that person who sacrifices, because senses of virtue and nobleness, they are higher. They're always higher. We all know that. But there might be objections, as my question suggests as well, but there are other objections to Mill's opinions. So possible objections might be as follows. Some might suggest that people are not as dignified as Mill suggests. They might not be happy when they sacrifice their happiness for others. In fact, they might be envious. And actually, this is a natural result. They might be envious because they don't own the happiness, but others own the happiness. And we can see that envy, we can feel that envy within us when we, even when we don't sacrifice, even when we see that other person is happier than us, when we think that we deserve it more. So we might refer back to Rousseau, I guess, in here, but I won't. So they might be envious. This is a natural result. But my reply to this possible objection would be, feelings of envy, hatred, and grudge are superfluous. They're temporary because they appear in us, but we can't live with them. We can live with these bad emotions that spoils us inside, that darkens our hearts. People are social beings, and that possess the need to socialize, and in order to socialize, they should conform to the moral sense of their community. So they should share a sense of virtue, and the sense of virtue around us. We see that people who make good deeds, like helping people, giving charity, or doing volunteer jobs, they earn our hearts, actually. Therefore, we see that there's a sense of morality around. There are a set of rules, moral rules, although we like it or not. We have to, I don't know, help a person who fell on the ground. And we shouldn't act in hatred towards a person who possesses happiness. We should be happy for them as well. These are the common, I don't know if I should say rules, but these are the common rules around us. We see every day, we've been taught them. We see even in Oscar ceremonies, their competitors win, but they feel like they should clap as well, or cheer and smile. But they're inside envious, maybe. And but they should conform back to the social norms, moral norms of the community, of society. So these feelings of envy, hatred are actually temporary. Hence, even if the vision of someone else's happiness makes them envious, they soon will get rid of the feeling in order to keep their social circles intact. So, thus, although the sacrifice creates feelings of envy, they soon will vanish for the sake of one's own utility in their social circle. So again, feelings of envy and hatred it actually does not benefit the person, actually harms that person, because people around that person will perceive that person as a bad person who can't even be happy for another person's happiness. So they should conform back to this for their own utility, for their own benefit. So I will provide an example about this topic of utilitarianism. And the first thing came to my mind was about parenting. So I will simply read and then comment on it. Let us take parenting sacrifices. There is a situation that I observed in most of the families around me. Well, most of the families around me have economic struggles as well. And they are uneducated generally. So in the city where I came, in a town where I came from, although there are disagreements between parents and they are not happy together in a marriage, Generally, they stay together in order to protect children from the trauma of divorce, but more or less they stick together since their economic conditions are not adequate to fund two separate houses, because sharing bills and sharing rent and sharing costs of a home is much more economical, actually. They're like roommates that hate each other. But they should stick together. But there are also children. They sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of children, because everyone can stand on their own. But if they have a child, they should have much more means to provide for them: their education, their mental faculties, their bodily health. So they stick together. They sacrifice from their own happiness for children's happiness. So this sacrifice, although it makes parents unhappy with their own lives, with their own relationship with their partner, contributes to the happiness of their children, and hence make them, the parents, happy in the end, because they made a sacrifice, and then they saw that this sacrifice made another person happy, or they made another person's life easier. Because otherwise their conscience will not allow them to take selfish actions for the sake of their individual happiness, while making their children miserable. So the conscience, where does it come from? It comes from the sense of morality around them, because if they leave their children, or if they condemn their children to poor life conditions, they wouldn't conform to the social norms of parenting, and they wouldn't conform to the social norms of, I don't know, love. So they actually sacrifice, and it is for their own utility in the end, even if in the beginning they shouldn't have had any kids. So this is my example. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.